Hi there, welcome to the latest lecture. Now in this one I'm going to be going through Machiavelli and Machiavelli's sort of political socio-philosophy. Now this is one that I know sort of personally because at the age of 7 I was given a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince alongside Sun Tzu's The Art of War at a very young age. 7, 8 years old, by my mother, and she said to me in her typical sort of Midlands accent, she said to me, "Son, if you ever read anything else, those two will set you right." So, being 7, 8 years old and typically trusting mother, I started reading them, started absorbing them, and at that age you generally tend to. So what is Machiavelli? Machiavelli was an interesting Italian politician slash philosopher. If I wouldn't say philosopher, but more of a socio-political commentator. And he differed from other philosophers in that most philosophers focus on the ideal state, so they focus on what they think the world should be. Machiavelli was kind of the first person to actually put into words not so much what the world should be, but what it actually is, and he did so in such a way that it caused shock because he was so blatant about things. He was so blatant about the parts of humanity that people didn't want to confront. So he was perfectly sort of content to describe some of the atrocities that were committed by the Borgias in those days, which is further reading for you. What Machiavelli essentially argued is essentially humanity is selfish. We only do things for our own benefit. That animalistic side of us, that natural, that's arguable, natural side of us. It is essentially we seek only to advance ourselves and our position. And this may extend somewhat to family and friends. But what Machiavelli sort of said caused obviously consternation, because up to that point it was a very heavy moral church-going society, and then he came along and said, well, actually no, essentially man, woman, everybody is selfish. They do things for themselves. If they claim any sort of morality, it is only so they look so to other people. So he was very, very down to earth with what he was suggesting. And the things that he kind of suggested were things like this. When you help someone, when you give money to a beggar, for example, most people will do it publicly because they get the public acknowledgement that they've been nice. Others, even if they don't do it publicly, they do it because there's a nice little feeling here. It makes you feel good. There is a feeling of altruism that I have done something. And that's what Machiavelli was arguing. It's that feeling of virtue that they are trying to go for. Not so much doing the action for virtue in and of itself, but for the fact that it makes either you feel good or it makes you look good to other people. And he maintained this with all sorts of relations between people, businesses, people and people. So in his view, we only ever, for example, if we select a mate, and I'm talking about males here, when we select a mate, we do so simply because they are attractive, or we do so because they have money or they have the lineage. That's more of a historic point of view, where women would have been married off to cement alliances and for dowries and political reasons. But he was very sort of down to earth in that he said, well, it's not so much this Camelot ideal of love. You do it simply because you you naturally need to mate. You naturally need to progress your genetic line. Even though genetics wasn't sort of around back then, it was understood that it was sort of what you naturally did. You created progeny. So his ideal argument in this was, it is a selfish reason. For men and women. Men will select the bustiest, or the one with the nice peachy bum, or they will select the one with the baby face and the button nose, or they will select one that, for example, will have political connections, or they will select one that is successful. There are people who marry into money. The point is this: people do things for their own selfish reasons. Here again, the similar argument comes up the other way. You know, to what aspect do women look for men who are hunky, who are massively built and muscled with a six-pack? We are bombarded with these images, almost in confirmation of the sort of selfish narcissisticness that Machiavelli said was inherent in humanity. So it's almost a vindication of his philosophy in a way. You know, because the actions that we do, even though we deny them, even though there will be people reading this and watching this who will be denying what I'm saying, society itself seems to back it up. We have pornography which is visual, and billboards for washing powder with very buxom women in lingerie. Even if we deny it, we seem to have this. And Machiavelli was the first person to say, well, actually, why do we even lie about it? Why can't we just be honest and admit that we are not so much removed from animals, and that this is just an entirely natural thing? Going back to the point, at what point do women go for the muscled guy? At what point do they go for the rich, successful guy with the Corvette? At which point do they go for the intelligent guy? At what point? The ideal is essentially, there's a book called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, and I think, though that makes the genetic argument, I think Machiavelli was looking at it from point of view of human psychology. But society seems to back up what we ourselves deny, and Machiavelli was the kind of, he shocked the world by actually saying, well, no, this is what it is. He was down to earth. And he might have been accused of a sort of cynical and negative outlook, but let's be honest here. How many people have done this? How many people will admit to themselves that they do things for selfish reasons, essentially? We all like to pretend to be virtuous and pretend to be honest and nice citizens, but we've all got the skeletons in our closets that we won't reveal to anyone, or we reveal only to our closest friends. What Machiavelli was arguing, I think, really, was the hypocrisy of the fact that we are essentially monsters, but we pretend to be angels, and it seems absurd. It seems absurd in a society that backs up our base animalistic natures for us to then claim to be angels. It seems odd that we can have a society where we are bombarded with sexual images, or we're bombarded with, you need to buy this, or we're bombarded with consumerism, or you need to fit in, you need to join this club, you need to do this. We do all this, and yet we seem to deny that we're affected and that we're actually pure perfect angels. And Machiavelli sort of turned that on its head and said, well, no, we're not. Which, of course, as you can imagine, in a very church-bound society back then, in the 1400s, would have caused a lot of consternation and controversy. Some of the things that he has spoken about is whether it is better to be feared or whether it is better to be loved. But the ideal is both. But if you cannot be both, then it is better to be feared, because man acts according, and here I include women as well in that definition, men and women act according to their own inclinations, essentially. And you may have all the love in the world, you may be the most popular person, but when the proverbial hits the fan, is love enough of a strong thing to keep people at your side or at your back? Machiavelli posited that it is not so much because of virtue and good that we keep ourselves in line, it is more the fear of punishment. And let's face it here. How many of us have said, "Oh, I'd do that if you weren't punished for it"? You know, how many of us have wished, a neighbour from hell or a work colleague we don't like? How many of us have wished that they were dead? Let's be honest, right? The only thing that stops us, according to Machiavelli, isn't some sort of pseudo-conscious. It's essentially that we will be punished if we do so. It is a detriment to ourselves, and it goes back to his idea: we only act in our own interests. And we may extend this somewhat to family, and then distantly to friends as well. But generally, when the proverbial hits the fan, we have our self-preservation. We preserve the individual first. The idea of Machiavelli was essentially that, and it became, as a book, I do recommend reading it because it does have a lot of the Italian history, such as the Borgias. It deals with things like the use of mercenaries in conquests. They aren't loyal. They don't fear you, and they don't love you either. They're there for coin. He deals with auxiliary forces, which can be obviously foreign forces that can either be allies or enemies. He deals with both the military and socio-political aspects of rule. So, for example, Machiavelli said that you actually cause anger and resentment in a populace if you disarm them, because it says that you fear them and you don't trust them. There's an interesting one for modern affairs. So, in summary, with Machiavelli, are we inherently selfish, and do we actually hypocritically deny that we are? Are we essentially animals and monsters that simply pretend to be angels? And for what purpose? Me personally, I've never understood why. Why do we have this hypocrisy? Why do we live in a world that we have virtue signalers? And this is rife in today's society now, virtue signalling. I'm not going to go too much into it, but it's people that they will do sort of inexcusable things that harm other people, but they will then justify it by claiming that they're doing something for the greater good. So, for example, I'm reporting you during this coronavirus for being out in a park, and they will justify it by saying, "Oh, it's the law," or they will justify it by saying, "Oh, I'm only doing it for the best interests of society. I'm only doing it so other people don't get." Let's face it, you're not. You're doing it according to Machiavellian logic because it makes you look good or you feel good. Right? If you sort of genuinely wanted to be good, make masks. Make some of the bands that they keep the masks on. The idea is this: if it is something that is negative, then according to Machiavellian logic, it is essentially just virtue signalling. You're being a hypocrite, you're doing it for your own selfish reasons. If it's a positive act, personally I think that there's a difference there. Machiavelli went so far as to not distinguish if it was positive or negative. You're still doing it for selfish reasons. We pick our partners for selfish reasons, we pick our houses for selfish reasons, we push our kids to do things that we ourselves sometimes won't even do ourselves. We try and live our dreams through our kids. Um, we do all these things and we justify these things by saying it's in the best interests of X, Y, Z. So Machiavelli was the first person just to basically smash that sort of hypocrisy and to say, no, we're doing it and we're doing all these things because we think it's good, we feel good when we do them, or it makes us look good to other people. So he was somewhat cynical in that regard. I do recommend reading The Prince though. It's a very interesting argument to argue rather than an ideal society and people are being positive. He argues that essentially we are selfish and we do things for our own edifice, essentially, our own sort of bigging up our own egos in a way. I'll leave that thought with you. In your own life, and look at yourself and in your own life. Do we do this? Have you met people that will claim that they are good or that they're virtuous? But if you really were, would you need to claim that you were? The more you are of something, the less you have to prove it. And I believe it was Arnold Schwarzenegger that said that. The more you are something, the less you have to prove it. So you have to wonder about people who claim that they're virtuous, to be honest. I'll leave that one with you anyway because this is getting quite long and it takes ages for me to upload these. So I'll leave that thought with you. Think about people you know, your own family, your parents, your sisters, your brothers, your aunties, your uncles. Think about your friends, and think about people that in society, perhaps even politicians and celebrities. How many are essentially Machiavellian? But doing things, being in the public eye, or doing things that are so virtuous, but realistically are just hypocrites doing it for themselves. How often do we make choices that just benefit us and we won't admit it? So there's something to think about.